Welcome back to our second session of this conference on theological genealogies and modernity. Our second speaker today is Professor John Milbank, who is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. He is most well known as the co-founder of the Radical Orthodoxy movement, which draws substantially from theological genealogies in order to reconfigure the relationship between philosophy and theology today. His theology and social theory remains a classic in the genre of theological genealogies we're considering in this conference. For our session today, his paper is entitled Genealogies of Truth, Theology, Philosophy, History. Over to you. You're muted, John.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pew, and thank you to everybody who's put on the conference and to all the other speakers whom I've really enjoyed listening to and reading their papers so far. I'm afraid in the case of my paper, you probably really have to read it to understand it. So I won't try to straightforwardly summarize it. I think the difficulty with the paper is that it's a kind of polyphony, really. There are several different themes that constantly interweave with each other. So I'll try and draw attention to what those themes are. First of all, I'm asking the question, can you do philosophy without history? And my answer would be quite definitely no. You know, ever since at least Hegel, you can't do that. If you carry on doing that, you are simply naive. In fact, you're not really philosophical. And obviously this would include some, but increasingly by no means all, and certainly not the best practitioners of analytic philosophy. So my reason for saying that is that I think that it's clear that philosophy operates with words, and if you operate with words, you're operating with language that has already been used for non-philosophical purposes, indeed mainly for non-philosophical purposes. And if you imagine the beginnings of philosophy, then previously it had never been used for philosophical purposes. So all words carry a freight of all sorts of historical events, social structures, cultural assumptions, and so on. And the philosopher simply arrives too late ever to be at the beginning. He has to assume the pre-reflective and operate within the pre-reflective, and therefore take a stance towards the pre-reflective, and consequently to take a stance towards history. Either the philosopher is having a sort of faith in what has already existed, or telling some kind of negative story about why up to this point history is deluded. And that can sometimes mean you're in a way rejecting history altogether. But even if you do that, you have to tell a negative story about why history has been so deluded. And as I say, I think in the end there are reasons why one can be very dubious about people claiming to make these absolute breaks with all that is gone before. That in the end they are themselves making a series of unjustified founding assumptions. You know, you have to make assumptions in order to get going, and so that they're just putting forward counter assumptions. And so that's why I argue after Foucault that we're always operating with a set of interlocking statements within some kind of discourse that is deficient in foundations. That doesn't, of course, mean that it's necessarily simply wrong, but the argument is that it's naive to imagine anything different. Then I'm also asking a question about the relationship of theology to history. So if I take that view about philosophy of history, it applies strongly to theology as well, and it applies a fortiori to theology, if you like. And so my view of the nature of divine disclosure, and especially of the incarnation, is that this isn't something you can isolate from the rest of history. It's much more that the divine, as it were, weaves itself into the fabric of history. That an oracular event has to be articulated in terms that already exist, even if it's making a difference to those terms, and even if language struggles to articulate what is occurring in some kind of a theophanic event. Nonetheless, we'd have to be completely silent about it if it wasn't related to the process of history. Then the third theme concerns a genealogy of what I think of as the general economy of theology as it still to some extent exists, although things are getting very looser, quite a lot looser. So I'm talking about the division between philosophical theology or philosophy of religion, systematic theology, biblical criticism, church history, apologetics, and so on. And so the question I'm there asking is, the way theology is currently set up, is that unquestionable? Is that sort of ahistorically obvious? And if that's the case, then we have to take into account the fact that it hasn't always existed in that way. So do we take the view that the way we practice theology in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries is a more rational way of doing theology, in which case we're locked into a story of progress that tends to concur with the general story of progress that we tell about modernity. Then the fourth theme concerns more directly the topic of this conference, the question of theological genealogies of modernity. And the relationship to the previous theme is that I'm claiming that you can only put forward a significant theological genealogy if you call into question the current economy of theology, because that's part and parcel of modernity. So that having a theological genealogy is in my mind inherently linked to recovering what I think of as a more authentic pattern of theology, which I'm calling an integrated or encyclopedic pattern of theology. And broadly speaking, this means you don't make any division whatsoever between theology and philosophy. That's completely discarded, following the lead of Jean-Yves Lacoste. And you see also history not as put in a sort of separate critical box, whether we're talking about biblical criticism or church history, but as an integral part of doing whatever you call Christian discourse. And you might call it theology, you might call it philosophy. It's a matter, to my mind, of complete indifference. You know, Augustine didn't think he was a theologian, for example. Nobody did really before the 13th century. And it's precisely in terms of dubious divisions, I think, between philosophy and theology that we eventually generate what is going to lead to the unquestionable authenticity of a secular space. Things like generations of a doctrine of pure nature, and then all sorts of other developments, which I briefly refer to, but I've written about at great length, and other people. Most of my genealogy is really just bits and pieces put together from other people, and I'm trying to assemble it into coherence. But broadly speaking, I think one gets something like an increasing suspicion of the pagan element in the Christian synthesis, you know, the Platonic element, the Neoplatonic element, and to some extent the Aristotelian element. And then you try to struggle out of that, and as a result you get univocity, nominalism, voluntarism, and so forth. You get a much more positivist discourse of theology that in a way looks much more pious and respectful towards God, but in fact has fallen into a dreadful kind of idolatry that encourages the primacy of the will, the atomization of reality that is typical of modernity, and then ironically fuses with the space of pure nature that an independent philosophy has eventually opened up. So most of what I say about all of that here is just alluding to work I've already done, except I do refer to more recent papers that have taken the new move of arguing that perhaps even Aquinas' separation of philosophical theology from sacra doctrina in his commentary on Boethius is a mistake. And this is also drawing on very interesting work by Jean-Luc Marion, showing that it's really only Aquinas that separate who invents kind of the idea of a self-contained revelation that we now work with. So a whole questioning of the very duality of reason and revelation is at work here. I mean, Aquinas is one of the last people to work with the Boethian corpus. And in that sense, he's in more continuity with the 12th century. And yet he's also, in certain important ways, breaking with it. So I'm slightly leaning more towards idealizing the 12th century now more than the 13th, though by no means discarding the 13th. And a very important element in that is clearly the impact of Arabic culture on the Latin West. This doesn't mean that all Islamic culture has a duality of philosophy and theology, it doesn't. But the aspect of Arabic culture that the Latin West was confronted with did much more tend to have that duality. And that, I think, had a huge impact. So the fifth strand in what I'm talking about is an attempt to throw a kind of curve ball into this conference, because we need to face up, I think, to the fact that genealogy, as it's first of all articulated by Nietzsche, is coming from the political right. So that, you know, most academics operate more or less on the political left. And it seems to me that so far you can see in this conference a sort of confused blending of genealogy with emancipatory discourses. But of course, these are completely different kinds of thing altogether. And the whole event in the 1960s, where a section of the left decided to adopt Nietzsche and to an extent Heidegger, we forget how strange that was. So I'm trying to remind us all of the idea that genealogy is a story of decline in the first place. It's a conservative thesis. And the sixth aspect of what I'm saying is showing that how from Nietzsche onwards, and a lot of people reacting to Nietzsche, in their mind is a criticism of the West. In other words, as with Heidegger also, it's a calling into question of the Platonic and Christian legacies. These supposedly noble things are shown as are supposed to have base origins in weakness and ressentiment and so forth. So then quite a lot of the paper then is taken up with the kind of Asian and esoteric versions of Nietzsche. And by the way, Nietzsche was in conversation with esotericists all the time. This is a very, very important dimension of his work. And so particularly, you've got the case of René Guénon saying, well, it's because we've forgotten our intellectual closeness to unity that we get this, reaction, lapse into weakness, multiplication, atomization, and so forth. But for him, that's inevitable because the one metaphysically manifests itself. Through that manifestation, it goes into decline. And I'm trying to suggest that people we talk about with great solemnity, and particularly Martin Heidegger, are in fact far closer to these people that we tend to think of as rather disreputable than the academy wants to acknowledge. That for Heidegger also, there is an inevitable falling away from being. Being can only manifest itself in beings, and that includes being, and that leads to the reign of technology and so on, which is not so much something culpably wrong as something inevitable. It's fated as far as he's concerned. And so then I want to contrast all that with a view represented to some degree by Henri Massy, whom I by no means agree about concerning everything, but stressing instead that the West is committed to a personalism, to a movement between an integration of the one and the many, that it doesn't see the many as simply a contamination of unity. And I'm careful to indicate that actually, there are some Eastern philosophies that also do that. It's not true to say that the whole of the East is monistic and so on. That's a caricature. But nonetheless, it seems to be a mark of the West, a mark of Christianity, that it's trying to insist both on the primacy of unity and yet the primacy of personality. I will do, and it's clearly bringing these together in the Trinitarian and Christological doctrines. So that if you are then, from a Christian point of view, telling a story of decline, then that becomes the rejection of personhood. By people, as it were, failing to live up to that kind of integration and the primacy and the challenge of personal expression, including the development of crafts. And then they appeal either to a kind of mushy collectivism or to merely kind of passive rights in reaction to that. So then from this point of view, and I'll now conclude, it becomes possible to see, something like the patristic period and the High Middle Ages, maybe with a culmination in the 12th century, to some extent the 13th, as indeed a kind of acme, not because it's a golden age or had everything right, but because one feels it was going generally in the right direction. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of what's happened since is simply a falling away. I mean, the Middle Ages has already more or less abolished slavery, and the impulse to abolish slavery lapses, but then comes back, for example. So authentic Christianity continues to resonate, and its aftermath, the post-Christian, continues to do a lot of good. And yet somehow, in the big picture, we've lost our way. We've lost any sense of unity or the common good. We've lost the primacy of the personal. Instead of that, we've interpreted our Western destiny not as the promotion of personhood and craft, but as the promotion of the machine. Progress may be a Christian idea. Christ changed the world for the better, said Aquinas. He opens up the possibility of progress. But for us now, progress has just become progress in technical control and the release of private personal freedom. So in that sense, in terms of the overall direction, we're now going the wrong way compared to the High Middle Ages. And the evidence for that is that increasingly we're making the planet entirely uninhabitable. That's all.
Thank you, John, for your presentation, and I look forward to our discussion, to your wide-ranging thesis. And I now want to introduce our respondent, Dr. Ragnar Vishay Bergem, who is no stranger to John's work, having written an important article in 2017 on the persistence of the genealogical in contemporary theology, published in Modern Theology. And he is a postdoctoral fellow at the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society based in Oslo. He's currently working on a project focusing on the place and meaning of representation in political life, analyzed from a theological perspective. I will now hand over to you, Ragnar.
Thank you so much, John. I haven't had too much time to sort of write up a response.
Not hearing you very clearly, Ragnar.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can turn up my. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you, but it's got a lot of background noise.
Okay, let's see if I can. Still, how is it working? Not very good.
Background noise and echo we can hear.
Very strange. Let me see. Let me switch my microphone. Okay, how does that work? Is that fine?
Better.
Okay. Again, thank you, John. What I have written might be sort of slightly rash and not really coherent, but I've tried to do two things. First, as you said, a polyphony might be a good word of describing this paper, and you've written an impressive, dense, and characteristically demanding paper on theology, philosophy, and history. Now, the first thing I want to do is try, in my own words, to sort of summarize your argument, and then I want to sort of delve into a polemic of some sort, if only just to create some discussion. So, if I've grasped the argument correctly, and I can't pull together all the strings, John's argument goes something like this. We can only give what we have already received, and what we have received is intrinsically historical. Any act of communication, even theological and philosophical ones, and these can hardly be disentangled, gains its meaning in a context of more or less coherent practices and discourses that are historically received and whose rationale can only be partially distinguished and reconstructed from these acts themselves. Reason, it follows, is not a transhistorical capacity that enables us to deduce certain claims or specify universal conditions of validity, but rather merely limited acts of reflection on what we have received. Reflections that, to be sure, add to the history they interpret and disclose, and that offer themselves up for further interpretation. Thus, any form of reasoning is also an offering to the future, something that someone else may receive, something for genealogies to come. And in particular, Socratic philosophy is said to enable a positive view of genealogy, because for Plato and Aristotle, the philosophical journey from doxa to episteme involves not only the rejection of myth, but a subtle and dialectical valuation that must affirm what is true in these mythical notions. Philosophy has nothing to say unless it has been historically received. In John's words, and I quote, "To the extent that any vertical scheme can only be expressed in terms of received notions and images, the positive cumulative process of arriving at this scheme is identical with the upshot of attainment." So this view of reason's role in history is not for John merely a methodological position, even though it's that too, but it's also Christologically grounded and indeed already traces some of the coordinates of his Trinitarian metaphysics. He pits this theology explicitly against contemporary theologies that still adhere to an ahistorical view of the theological task, for example, variations of neo-scholasticism or analytic theology. These seek to find a place in between the putatively objective disciplines of church history and biblical studies on the one hand, and an implicitly secular philosophy that imposes its criteria of validity on the other. By contrast, John argues that the ultimate conclusion of Christological orthodoxy is that the Logos itself revealed itself in a particular man, Jesus of Nazareth, inasmuch as this historically situated individual was subsumed into the divine being. And this occurs without God ceasing to be God. More importantly, for our purposes, is the fact that, and here I quote him, on this earth, the absolute truth itself has a cognitive ancestry. And this is not only because God has entered into time, but because his mode of entering was precisely as a correction and completion of past intimations of the divine. So the very shape of the divine act is already historically mediating with the past and the future. John also, I just want to note, slips in an argument for a particular view of the nature-culture relationship by pointing out that Christ's royalty was granted him through adoption, through Joseph, while his priesthood was granted through the Virgin Mary. Implicitly, this view of culture nature corresponds to a male-female duality, and so actually confirms Christians' claim that genealogies are genderologies. And I suspect
that's a minefield, I know that.
and I suspect
I don't know the answers though.
Yeah. Thus, John lays out a profoundly historical view of theology and rationality, which turns the genealogical into an essential part of the theological task, not just a preliminary. But he also contrasts such a theological genealogy with a tradition from Nietzsche and makes an argument for the influence of Vedantic monistic thought on Nietzsche, Guénon, and later Heidegger, according to which time is a future falling away from a primordial prehistorical unity. For such a monistic philosophy, the genealogical method is essential but primarily negative, inasmuch as it becomes a way of tracing a fall from unity. Time is simply the distribution of fragmentation. John associates this view with nominalism and mechanistic disintegration, and then brings in the French conservative Henri Mazet to argue that such a disintegration will inevitably call for, and I quote, Oriental spiritual techniques to overcome personhood. And by overcoming personhood, you can escape back from history into primordial unity. So John's argument therefore ends with proposing a personalist counter-genealogical critique against this Teutonic philo-Asiatic legacy. And he pits a craft-based society against the machine of nominalistic technocracy. And then all of this is folded back into the Christological argument when John argues that every, and I quote, new fragmentary synthesis, even and therefore paradigmatically, the ultimate and unsurpassable synthesis manifest in Christ, still makes way for new synthesis, new performances, and new craft expressions in the future, end of quote. He ends the paper by returning to the contemporary ahistorical theologies and argues that such theologies can only take shelter in the microscopic and ever diminishing house of Kantian philosophy. Only if one revisits a number of the decisions, such as those in the 13th and 14th centuries, is there still some hope for theology. Okay, so that's my summary of your paper, John.
Really brilliant one. Fantastic.
Now, I find it difficult to assess the paper as a whole, and there are many things I think about it. And also, I would later on be, not now, but later on be interested with discussing Lacoste with you. But for the sake of discussion, I've chosen a somewhat polemical approach, and what I have is not entirely coherent, but I want to throw this out and then we'll see where we go. So let me begin with the following concern. There's a strong, and I want to say a strong tendency in John's genealogies, including those he gestured towards in his paper, to conflate logical or metaphysical consequence with historical causality. Despite his radically historicist ontology, John is not excessively concerned with historical detail. But more importantly, I see a tendency to overdetermine historical narration with the theological or metaphysical vision, So what is a metaphysical consequence, nominalism leads to nihilism, for example, is treated as historical causation. Conversely, the alternative metaphysical vision is presented as a solution to our historical problems. A craft-oriented society sure seems like a good thing, and I'm not trying to be ironical here. But what reason do I really have to believe that it would be better than what we have now, or a range of other alternatives? We are given a philosophical metaphysical argument, a grand vision, and a long-term narration, yes, but actually very little that would provide me with confidence that the alternative would be better should it be realized. And remember, the place of realization is not another world or another history. Its realization would have to occur now in the world in which we currently live. Borrowing a statement from Peter Harrison's paper, I too worry that, quote, it becomes possible to populate implicit counterfactual histories with a range of imagined virtues that contrast favorably with actual history. But because these counterfactual histories never transpired, it's difficult to offer a realistic assessment of them. Unquote. And I think this sometimes applies to John as well. Now, my intention here is not to disparage the metaphysical vision, nor all of the cultural, political, and historical ideals playing their part in John's narrative. I've learned so much from that. But I'm worried that this vision is pronounced with such a force that the possibility of a challenge from the outside, of submitting one's theological vision to judgment, is practically ruled out. And now let me explain that. If John's historicist view of reason is correct, it would follow that the superiority of one's vision is limited indeed, since it is entirely dependent on received practices and discourses, and since its manner of going beyond what is received cannot be justified beforehand. Additionally, the constructed vision must fundamentally be an offering to the future. It must submit itself to future interpretations and corrections. It follows from John's position, of course, that it does not make sense to measure theological statements or other statements according to a universal natural reason of any sort. But all of this does not, I think, give us license to prejudge almost everything in the light of Trinitarian metaphysics as we have derived it from the action of Jesus Christ. But this is what I think John too often does, thereby disallowing any real encounter with something that is foreign to his own vision. He has, therefore, little to say about the obvious tensions we constantly live with between theological visions and religious practices on the one hand, and every other historically conditioned practice and discourse we partake in on the other. Should we not rather take the cue from his historicism and instead treat our vision with a little more humility, admitting that it cannot, in fact, say something meaningful and relevant about every particular historical trajectory or contemporary discourse? To get some grasp of this problem, I think we need to return to the distinction between fact and interpretation. John is right to emphasize the delusion of historical neutrality, and he also does very well in pointing out the combination of legend and fact in the scriptures, for example, since every fact is to some extent interpreted, and every interpretation is in some sense mythical. Yet, even if we grant the fact that fact and interpretation cannot be completely separated, if we do not allow for the persisting difference between them on some level, I worry that we will erase the facts through our interpretations, that we will obscure the surpluses and gaps that ought to confront our scheme. We have only what we receive, but what if we constantly disregard received treasures precisely because we have already arrived at the conclusion, because we already know where the story leads? Thus, I worry that John risks effacing the distinction between fact and interpretation in several parts of this theological task. His Christology, for example, shows symptoms of an indifference to the particulars of Christ's life, because what seems most important is the Trinitarian metaphysics that the life stands for. There's little to struggle with in his Christology, not even the cross, because the facts of Jesus' life have disappeared behind a scheme of prefiguration, fulfillment, and further expectation. a scheme that I grant is certainly there in the New Testament, but not one that takes us very far into the depths of biblical interpretation. Similarly, in his genealogies of modernity, I also think he's sometimes more interested in valuation than in facts. And he writes striking and enlightening narratives, but often the facts seem oddly stacked somehow. And in his cultural and political analysis, products, practices, and institutions are often not evaluated according to some finite criteria of relevant disciplines, but are instead read as if they were mere approximations to or deviations from his metaphysical position. Now, one of the reasons why this tends to happen is that I think this is perhaps an obvious point, but is that John is worried about allowing a space for a natural, a purely natural, and therefore secular reason. And if we acknowledge the consistent discrepancy between fact and interpretation, we must admit that we are constantly engaging in negotiations and rationales that cannot be entirely explicated according to the vision to which we consciously hold. But acknowledging these tensions threatens to open up a space between and so construct the categories of revealed theological vision on the one hand and common rationality on the other. It demands a discussion of what we do when the scheme of reflection we adhere to does not cohere with our other ways of thinking and being. And from that realization, it seems like a short path to a demand for a universal procedure. Yet, since John rarely allows us to attend this tension, he risks insulating this theological vision from outside judgment. And I'm approaching the end. I agree with John that theologians must admit that Christology is always already metaphysics, and that a neo-scholastic appeal to universal natural reason is unpalatable. But should not a deeply historicist view of rationality allow that we live in a manifold of episteme, not just as a matter of fact, but as partially constitutive of what we are and think, and that there is a cost to reducing this manifold in the light of whatever metaphysical interpretation we ascribe to? Does not the important space of judgment take place precisely in that interim between our theological vision that we ascribe to and the many forms of reasoning that are not theologically valid or orthodox, but that we, like it or not, treat as valid somehow nonetheless? I'm the first to admit that John has developed an incredibly sophisticated and impressive theological vision that puts a primacy on cultural production and historical interpretation, and I've learned a lot from it. But what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that some of the mediation and openness that he is in principle supporting disappears in his genealogical writings, including in this paper. In facing the difference between fact and interpretation, the interpretation is shielded from the facts, and the facts are effaced in light of interpretation. And I want to end by staying with that final point for a little longer. There is a tendency in John's writing of treating cultural, political, and historical expressions as merely competing theories of divine being. Thus, such products become primarily exemplary, not objects of engagement and negotiation. Sure, an episode in the endlessly funny TV show Ted Lasso is open for a theological critique for its sentimental, moralistic, happy-go-lucky attitude to life. But when and how do we decide that we should primarily treat it as a competing theory of the beatific vision? And when do we decide not to? Put it in Milbankian terms, if the finite infinite boundary is inherently unstable, how can we be so sure precisely how and when a cultural product should be read as intimating the divine? The danger is of prejudging culture and history, or treating particulars by saying, that's the space where I will find an example of truth. The total Christ includes every particular, and so allows for infinite particularity and interpretation. That's more or less fine by me. But our vision of Christ is not everything. And particulars should not only interest us because there are exemplifications of the infinite particularity of the Christological universal, but they should interest us in their particularity. To put it in other words, even if I can find Christ everywhere, It does not mean that I can find Christ everywhere according to my vision of who Christ is. That is, and that I think is a lesson that we can learn from the Gospels.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this comprehensive response, Ragnar. In a minute, I would invite the rest of the panelists back on, and I see already some questions in the Q&A. Please, may I encourage you, if you have a question to both Ragnar or John, now is a good time to put it in the chat box. But John, would you like to respond to some of the concerns? Maybe 1 or 2 points, please.
Yes, I don't want to take up too much time because Ragnar covered an awful lot of ground there, which is fair enough because I did, and he made some very lucid points. I think the points about the logical and the historical is quite a difficult one, because I think there's a level of generality in which you can say what nominalism is likely to lead to, but there's also an element of specificity where you can't just a priori anticipate all the things it has in fact led to. So I think there's a mixture of both things going on, and that would lead me to the point that in stressing historicity, I'm not trying to deny the importance of the dimension of the engagement with the vertical. On the contrary, I think the whole point is that just because you can't found a discourse comprised of interlocking statements, you are making a kind of conjecture about ultimate reality. You're saying that, in some way we're representing ultimate reality. And I do think all cultures, as Erik Bergem concluded, are somewhat like that. So, and then the point becomes one of saying, well, yes, we are truly trying to engage with the metaphysical, but there isn't going to be a final metaphysics. There's not going to be a final Leibnizian system. So in a funny kind of way, as the Romantics saw, every metaphysics turns out after all to be a fragment, if you like, that we keep on having to do it again. And so there's a sense in which not every event is contained within a framework. It's always breaking out of that framework. But I'm not rejecting the idea of having to have a provisional framework in the name of some kind of relativism. Absolutely not. I'm pro-metaphysics. I'm simply insisting, rather in the way somebody like Collingwood did, that metaphysics and history belong together. They're inseparable. Then very quickly, the point about fact and interpretation. I think the way I would handle that would be twofold. I would first of all want to insist that somehow a sacral space, whether of the Bible or some other sacred text, is somehow set up so that we can't readily disentangle fact and interpretation in the way we ordinarily do, because the claim is that we're talking about some kind of, super saturated significance in a series of events or a series of prophecies and so on. The claim of a kind of epiphany makes it difficult to do that. But I think I would furthermore want to say in general that there aren't pure facts, not because there aren't objective things that we can't ever fully fathom, but because given realities are super full of significance, if you like. It would be a secular idea to assume there are just brute facts. But if I think that the world is created, then I think it's fuller of any kind of meaning than I would ever be able to fathom. So from the God's point of view, interpretation and reality do coincide. And I can only sort of roughly grope towards that. Probably that's probably enough points to have tried to deal with for now.
Thank you for keeping it brief, John.
Yeah.
Panelists want to come in at this point. Oh, yes, Brad.
Just real briefly, thanks, John, so much. 2 points. The first, in support, and I'm sure you know this. I was always amused by Bernard of Clairvaux in your very apex 12th century, in his dispute with Peter Abelard, referring to that newfangled term theologia as stultologia, right? Stupidology.
Yes.
Just a little tidbit.
Yes, that's very germane.
Yeah, exactly. On the other hand, slavery didn't disappear in the Middle Ages. Charles Verlinden wrote his huge 2-volume work on slavery in medieval Europe in 1955.
Yeah,
a whole
but
second volume.
it was mitigated. Yes.
Well, yes, it was mitigated, right? There was a slave society in the Roman Empire. It broke up, and what we have is a long, complicated transmutation into feudalism in a whole variety of different ways. But you know, the first 100 pages of John Noonan's book, A Church That Can and Cannot Change, devoted to Christianity and slavery, which persists. Popes own slaves, religious orders own slaves, bishops own slaves throughout the Middle Ages, and right into the early modern period, and that revival of slavery that you talked about. So I think that's very important. There's been a long tradition of Christians claiming that, oh, thank goodness, you know, Christianity came along because slavery went away. It didn't. End of a slave society, not the end of slavery. And I personally think that every theologian who thinks highly of the Middle Ages should be required to master the social and economic history of Chris Wickham about the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages, and then think hard about, you know, what kind of a society this was and how good it was for most of the inhabitants.
Actually, since we're in the Middle Ages, I want to throw in the question that from the audience, which I think is a very good one. It's from Joey Bellezza, and it asks, thank you, Professor Milbank. Could it be more accurate to say that rather attributing a growing divide between Philosophia and Sacra Doctrina to Aquinas, that it was in fact the late Bonaventure within the strength of 13th century Franciscanism influenced by both the effective Dionysianism of Thomas Gallus and more eschatologically immanent interpretations of Joachim de Fiore, who pushed for a harder distinction between reason and faith, and that this Franciscan position becomes more explicitly influential in medieval university theology after the Parisian condemnations of 1270 and 1277 via the authority of Bonaventure's student Etienne Tembier.
Yes, all that is completely correct. There's only a bit of a danger opening up in Aquinas. It's vastly increased by these Franciscan currents. That summary the questioner just gave it is correct, I think. Yeah.
I see a hand from Christine. Do you want to come in?
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you for your presentations. I'm really interested in Ragnar in what you have to say about the relationship between sort of history and metaphysics. I mean, I find it really difficult to sort of swat away the ghost of Christian supremacy in these depictions of metaphysics and history. And I'm wondering how we can understand this relationship, which I think is a fascinating one, but in ways that are promoting the kinds of interests that you outlined in your paper. So I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think I can start by saying that I'm a bit worried about overloading the sort of metaphysical aspect of the theological task, or putting too much emphasis there. Even though I'm someone naturally attracted to thinking in those terms, but I'm worried when that aspect of the theological work becomes too sort of heavy and sort of sucks up all of the other things that we have to do as theologians. I guess what I was trying to say to John is that I still follow him in saying that as we do theological work, we cannot not do metaphysics. and so I see no means of escaping from that. And I also agree with sort of aspects of the historicist version that he proposed at least. But I find a lot of the theological task interesting, precisely not in those areas where a grand scheme can be applied, but without denying that I have some grand schemes and that I can't not have them. I find really interesting work being done when I'm negotiating with something that is unknown to me or unknown to broader society, and where sort of the field is more open in terms of where the theological work is taking us. And that was sort of my worry in terms of how metaphysics can over-determine the historical task, for example. And so, one example, I'm currently working on a project on political representation and sort of crisis of representation in contemporary societies. And I mean, one way of theologically approaching that would, for example, be to sort of develop a theology of the body of Christ, which could go in many directions and relate that to sort of the fragmentation of contemporary societies. And sure, that's something you can do, and you can sort of develop a vision and say that this is somehow relevant. But I find at least the starting place for me is trying to figure out on what terms now contemporary societies are struggling to understand themselves, and without prejudging how my theological work can help with that. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I can go much further right now, but yeah, that's somewhere I would start at least. Yeah.
Would you like to come back, Christine?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I agree with you. I think metaphysics is important, but it depends on the kinds of values and the values attached to the metaphysics. I am actually one for a more deflationary metaphysic. We've learned in sort of modern historiography that sort of outlining a meta-narrative with sort of determinism is probably not the best, most accurate way to do history. But I think as in a Christian theological mode, I think a kind of a light metaphysic that would open up the possibilities of humans imagining new futures and imagining new ways of being together would be the kind of sort of metaphysical direction that that I think is needed. But thank you, Ragnar.
Can I also just briefly just reply to that? That I also believe, and I alluded to that in my response, that I think in sort of submitting one's interpretation of things, and this is something I think you agree with because you've written a book on it, and you're in doing the theological task and providing it. The offering is, and that's implied in John's view as well. You're also offering something for judgment, right? You're offering yourself to judgment as you do it, right? And for me, it's important that that figures out in not just that I should say whatever I want to say and then wait for the judgment, but it has to influence how I actually do the theological work itself. Yeah.
Thank you. Any panelists would like to come in on the issues we've discussed so far before I move on? Let me bring in another question from Ryan McDermott. John, you jokingly said you're now idealizing the 12th century rather than the 13th. It is a question of when theology and philosophy, as well as revelation and reason, splits apart. Mark Young is saying it was beginning already with Thomas Aquinas. Do you see this as a necessary revision of your central narrative of modernity, or rather one of many narratives that complement each other? I suppose anyone can comment on this, but John, you can go first.
Well, yeah, it's only, I suppose, a small mutation, but it's striking to contrast Aquinas, who doesn't seem to, when he's articulating metaphysics, he He doesn't give us a Trinitarian and a Christological metaphysics. Now, it's possible to argue that really, ultimately, he does. And I think that is correct. But he doesn't do so ostensibly and directly. Whereas, for example, an author who was only really discovered in about the 1980s, the English monk of St. Victor, Ashard, not Richard, but Ashard, wrote this extraordinary treatise on the unity and multiplicity of God, which opens with the astonishing statement that God is more plural than the creation, as well as more unified than the creation, and then develops an entire kind of Trinitarian metaphysics around that insight. So it's a completely integrated discourse. And you can see that kind of approach, which is particularly associated with Chartres, returning already with Eckhart, but then more emphatically with Nicholas of Cusa, and we now know a lot more about his Boethian sources. And I tend to be sympathetic to this kind of approach for the reasons I've set out in my my paper. That I think it's artificial to think that Christians suppose that God is unified and then as a kind of appendix that he's also Trinitarian. No, we think of God as Trinitarian because we think of him as unified. We think the Trinity spells out the meaning of the unity of God in rather the way that something like Thierry of Chartres tried to argue. And then I think that one of the interesting things about adopting that approach is that if you look at people like Raymond Lull or Nicholas of Cusa, who quite definitely offer these Christocentric and Trinitarian philosophies without really making any division between theology and philosophy, they are the very people who start to engage in interreligious dialogue. So, not the people who are saying, we're offering this kind of neutral theological philosophy that we might share with Islam as well, but then debate about details. On the contrary, those people tend to say, the Arabs aren't seeing the universal properly because they're in, because they're in the wrong faith. It seems like somebody like Cusa, who, one of the first people to engage with the Quran and so on, is almost able to do that because he knows that his own universal perspective is still a perspective. Okay, he thinks it is in some sense the more ultimate one because of his belief in the incarnation, but he nonetheless is able to recognize that sort of other universal pictures are perspectives on an ultimate that escapes everybody, all of us, because it's transcendent. So I think that that's perhaps an example of the way in which keeping the particular and the universally metaphysical together actually furthers discourse rather than human interaction of different cultures, rather than inhibiting it, because in a way you're being honest and upfront about the difference, but that also can help you to see things that are shared and things that different cultures can learn from each other.
Right, can I have a quick comment from you, because I want to bring in one last question.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say about the reference, John, to Raymond Lull's career in interreligious dialogue, as I'm sure you know, was cut short rather quickly when he preached in the Holy Land and was promptly stoned to death by the Muslims. That's neither here nor there for your main point, but it was an inauspicious, let's say, moment in Christian Muslim interreligious dialogue. The other point I want to make is just that the point about Aquinas making the distinction that you call attention to, unless Marion made that point prior to Michael Buckley's At the Origin of Modern Atheism in 1987, the latter should be given credit for it because he makes it there.
Okay, but no, fair enough. He's not really the first person to say this. I mean, de Lubac and so on noted that there was no theology of revelation as a topic before the 13th century. But I think he's added some interesting precisions more recently that I found very good anyway.
I'm afraid that's all that we have time for, despite all the questions going through. I would encourage the floor to send in questions earlier, because some of them are really very, very important. Thank you, John and Ragnar, for your contribution. Especially one of the attendees has suggested that could someone please buy Ragnar beer for such a response? I suggest we extend it to
2 bears.
see you in 5 minutes, everyone, with our next session with Jonathan Teubner and with a response from Christine Helmer.